The churches, which had been previously half empty, were so full on Sundays that you could hardly get a seat. People choosing to believe because it suits them, Charles used to say. We've all been guilty of that, Jack. Dear Charles. When he descended on Oxford, it was with such commentary blaze. Charles Williams, a man whose lectures were so celebrated that you could hardly get a seat there as well. Lectures delivered without a single note, perfectly coherent, and delightfully peppered with quotations in his incantatory manner. I shall never forget a lecture that he gave on chastity. Simply as criticism, it was superb. For here was a man who cared with every fiber of his being for that serious doctrine of virginity. It was a beautiful sight to see a room full of young men and young women spellbound, sitting in that absolute silence that cannot be faked. I had at last, if only for once, seen a university doing what it was intended to do and founded to do, teaching wisdom. Speaking of World War II and the increased interest in Christianity, even the BBC got in on the act. They asked me if I would do a series of talks on the basics of Christianity. They even said they thought it might help boost morale. Well, I agreed, and the first series that I did I felt were a complete failure. But I consoled myself with the fact that I wasn't the first ass that God had used, and probably wouldn't be the last. I did 3 series in all, and no one, certainly not I, realized how popular they would become. Oh, whether they boosted the British morale, I cannot say. I do know this, that my publisher urged me to edit them into a book. It's ironic, really. But for the Second World War, I doubt that Mere Christianity would have ever been published. Oh, now I can see what you're thinking. You're thinking, this author is not to be trusted. He said he wasn't going to speak about his books or how he wrote them. Well, now that I've transgressed, I might as well do it again. During World War II, we were constantly bombarded with German propaganda broadcasts that cut through our regular programming. Couldn't do anything about it. And one day, one of these propaganda broadcasts came through, and it was Hitler. And I jumped up to turn it off, obviously. And as I got to the radio, I stopped. I was stunned by the power of his oratory. It was compelling. Of course, I did turn it off in the end. The next Sunday, I was coming out of church, and I was reflecting on this incident and the fact that we as Christians face a very compelling enemy. And then it struck me. I came up with an idea to write a book that would look at the psychology of temptation only from the other point of view. And that book was called The Screwtape Letters. And it went on to be one of my most successful books ever. Do you know what? It even landed me on the front cover of Time magazine. September 1947. Did any of you see it? No? Oh, well, you haven't missed much. Charles, by the way, was asked to write a review on Screwtape in one of the magazines. I forget which one. I won't tell you whether he wrote good or ill of it. I will tell you how he finished his review. It went like this. Dear Scorpuscle, I hate this book, this heavenly book. It's heavenly dangerous. This giveaway of hell. Your friend, Snicksozzle. P.S. You will send someone to see after Lewis, some very clever fiend. Oh, by the way, when I read the first few chapters of Screwtape to Tollers, he was very unenthusiastic. He thought I was playing with fire, but I was determined that he should read it all. But how could this be achieved? Hollis can be a very stubborn man if he wants to. And then it struck me. I know how I can get him to read it. I'll dedicate the book to him. Well, I want to go and see if I can find Warnie. I want to make a cup of tea for you, and I think he might be at Richard's, so I'm going to go and give a quick call. While I'm gone, why don't you stretch your legs? You'll find some conveniences around. I think you call them restrooms. How odd. I can't think of any room least likely to afford a good rest. Well, if you give me a couple of minutes, I'll be back in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail. Anybody seen Warnie? Well, I phoned Richard, and he's not there. I don't know where he could have got to. I know where he's gone to. He's always doing this on me. He stopped off at the pub for a pint of beer. I have to watch him, you know. Sometimes rather overdoes it. But I think he's a little better now that he's recognized that he's got a problem. There's a self-deprecating air about it. He's always trotting out this little poem. Quite humorous, I always think. And I don't know whether I can remember it. I'll do my best. How does it go now? 'Twas an evening in November, as I very well remember. I was walking down the street in drunken pride. My knees were all aflutter, so I lay down in the gutter. And a pig came up and lay down by my side. As I lay there in the gutter, thinking thoughts I ought not utter, a lady passing by was heard to say, "You can tell a man who boozes by the company he chooses." And the pig got up and slowly walked away. Don't tell Warnie I told you, will you? It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of an angry BPB. Well, I've told you a little bit about my childhood, told you a little bit about my education, told you a little bit of how I became a Christian. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about my wife. As I say, she died 3 years ago. But first we must go back to 1950, the year that The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe was published. I've always received a lot of correspondence from people who have read my books, and I always make a point to answer every one of them. Warnie helps me in this endeavor. He can use a typewriter, I can't. Even if I could, I would stick to handwriting. I think it's far more personal. Still, I suppose typewriters are here to stay. Anyway, one day we had an unusually large postbag, and partly because there were a lot of letters from America. So I said, well, Warnie, you take the English ones and I'll take the American ones. The first letter I opened was from a Mrs. Joy Gresham. And though she and I had never met, and it was the first letter I'd had from her, she wrote as if she knew me. I mentioned this to Warnie, and he said, well, that's really par for the course for Americans, Jack. I said, what do you mean it's par for the course? He said, well, they give the impression that they know you. They're far too friendly. I said, Warnie, I think we English can do with a little bit of this American friendliness. He said, well, you can have my portion, Jack. Well, as I knew this conversation was clearly going nowhere, I returned to my letter, and I was very impressed with her perceptiveness and her wit. So impressed that I wrote back immediately. Not long after that, I got a letter back from